Senator JD Vance, welcome back to Meet the Press.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you. Thank you for sitting down with us. I want to start with some of the news this week. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin confirmed that North Korean troops are training in Russia and potentially bound for the war in Ukraine. The U.S. intelligence community confirmed that Russia is creating disinformation to sow doubt in the upcoming presidential election. Let me ask you this question, Senator. Do you see Russian President Vladimir Putin as an ally or an enemy?
Well, I think that he's clearly an adversary. He is a competitor. But I think that we also have to be smart about diplomacy, too. Just because we don't like somebody doesn't mean that we can't occasionally engage in conversations with them. And I think it's important, if we're ever going to end the war in Ukraine, fundamentally at some level, we're going to have to engage in some sort of negotiation between Ukraine, between Russia, between our NATO allies in Europe. And that's just a necessary part. Doesn't mean we have to like it, by the way. Doesn't mean we condone the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I think that sometimes you do have to engage in diplomacy, even with and maybe especially with your adversaries. I think the bigger problem, Kristen, if we step back for a little bit, of course, we're on the cusp, obviously, of a presidential election where I want the American people to select my running mate as the next president. Whether it's the cost of groceries, whether it's the southern border, and importantly, whether it's the chaos all over the world, I think really the theme of this election is that Kamala Harris broke things in the world, in the country, and Donald Trump will fix it. And if we get back to his steady leadership, it's not just going to mean lower grocery prices at home. It's also going to mean a much more stable and peaceful world.
When you say that he's an adversary, just to get back to the question, you're not willing to go so far as to call him an enemy.
Well, we're not in a war with him, and I don't want to be in a war with Vladimir Putin's Russia. I think that we should try to pursue avenues of peace. I'd also call China certainly a competitor, but we're not in a war with China either. I do think, though, that China constitutes the biggest threat that we have for the United States of America, and I think that we have to be serious about it. But I think we have to be careful about the language that we use in international diplomacy. We can recognize, obviously, that we have adversarial interests with Russia. We can condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I have, and of course the president has, but we also need to engage in some smart diplomacy if we're ever going to get out of the mess that Kamala Harris has left us in and get back to a posture of peace.
And of course, Donald Trump was president for 4 years while Russia was essentially invading Crimea. Why didn't he kick him out when he had the chance? He had 4 years.
Oh, I think that's a misunderstanding of the history, Chris. I look at that much differently.
Well,
First of all,
fighting going on.
We had Russia invade another country, a sovereign nation, during Obama. We had Russia invade a sovereign nation during Bush's term. We had Russia invade a sovereign nation during the leadership of Kamala Harris. The 1 4-year term where Russia did not launch a full-scale invasion against a neighbor was under the leadership of Donald Trump. We also have to remember, just on that point, if Donald Trump had not given Ukraine javelins, the country would not exist as an independent sovereign nation anymore. So the idea that Donald Trump wasn't sufficiently strong on Russia, I think, is belied by the actual history of the period.
Again, there was fighting going on for 4 years during Donald Trump.
But there wasn't a full-scale invasion. I think that's important.
Let me ask you, because there are real concerns about Vladimir Putin invading NATO allies. Under a Trump-Vance administration, can you pledge, sitting here today, that the U.S. will continue to remain a member of NATO?
Of course, we're going to honor our NATO commitments, but I think it's important, Kristen, that we recognize that NATO is not just a welfare client. It should be a real alliance. And this is a strong difference between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Donald Trump wants NATO to be strong. He wants us to remain in NATO, but he also wants NATO countries to actually carry their share of the defense burden. Under Kamala Harris's leadership, we've actually seen how weak NATO is as a full-scale military alliance. It's effectively the United Kingdom, a couple of other nations, and the United States. NATO's problem is, particularly Germany, has to spend more on security, has to spend more on defense. We can't be the policeman of the world. We want NATO to be an alliance, not just a dependent of the United States.
NATO has been unified in defending Ukraine. Just to be very clear, though, you would stay in NATO. Just a yes?
We would stay in NATO, Kristen, but this is important. You're right. NATO has done, some of the countries have done a lot, but actually some of the countries relative to GDP have done very little in Ukraine, and that's important. And this, again, we're talking to the American people, of course, and I think a very significant difference between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump is Kamala Harris would like to use our tax dollars and our troops to subsidize Europeans not taking care of their own security. Donald Trump wants Europe to step up big time to become a real ally of the United States and not just a dependent.
Senator, let's move on, because you talked about the threat from China. So this week we learned that China was behind a broad hacking campaign targeting the phones headlines of both presidential campaigns highlighting the threat that China poses to this country. And yet Donald Trump recently called his domestic political opponents, quote, the enemy from within, and said they are more dangerous than Russia and China. Do you believe that people like Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi are more dangerous than Russia and China?
Well, I think what Donald Trump said is that those folks pose a greater threat to United States' peace and security because America is strong enough to stand up to any foreign adversary.
Do you agree with him? They pose a larger threat to the United States than Russia and China?
What he said, and I do agree with this, what he said is that the biggest threat we have in our country, it's not a foreign adversary because we can handle these guys. We can handle foreign conflicts. We can handle, look, under Nancy Pelosi's long life in public leadership, the United States has gone from the preeminent industrial power of the world to second next to China. That fundamentally belongs on Nancy Pelosi's shoulders. And if we're going to have a more prosperous country, we've got to recognize our own leadership is why we lost our industrial base to China. Our own leadership is failing to lead this country into peace and prosperity. And of course, Kamala Harris, look, when I look at the biggest threats to America, Kristen, I think the fact that people can't afford groceries, the fact that we can't meet our recruitment goals in the military, the fact that Americans have a wide open southern border, that's a way bigger threat than any foreign threat. And yes, it's caused by broken leadership.
And yet, Senator, as you know, inflation is coming down. Let me ask you about some of what we've heard here.
25% higher, Kristen, than it was when Donald Trump left the Oval Office. Do Americans, and I think this is an important issue, if Americans feel like inflation is a solved problem, then maybe they should vote for Kamala Harris. If you feel like the price of groceries, if you feel like the price of housing is too high, if you feel like inflation is not over, then Donald Trump is your man.
Right. There's no doubt folks believe that groceries are too high. Just making the point that inflation has come down.
I agree with those
Let
folks.
me ask you about some of what we've heard here in the U.S. this week. Donald Trump's longest-serving chief of staff, General John Kelly, said Donald Trump is a fascist. He echoed comments made by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, who also called him a fascist. When two four-star generals who worked so closely with Donald Trump call him a fascist, why shouldn't voters believe them, Senator?
Well, I think that Mark Milley and John Kelly are both disgruntled former employees, and very many of the things that they accused Donald Trump of, people who were in the room at the time some of those comments were made, they have said explicitly Donald Trump didn't say the things that he was accused of. And look, Donald Trump was already president for 4 years. If he was what John Kelly said he was, then why did Donald Trump deliver peace and prosperity? He didn't arrest his political opponents, as Kamala Harris and her Department of Justice have in fact done.
There's no evidence of that, Senator, that Kamala Harris has arrested their political opponents. The Department of Justice has not been going after political opponents. Senator, there's no evidence of that.
The current Department of Justice, under the leadership of Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, has absolutely been going after the political opponents of the current Democratic Party. I think that's a disgrace, but it's happening.
There's no evidence that the DOJ is going after their political opponents. Donald Trump was indicted by federal grand juries. Let me ask you, though, you said that they're disgruntled employees. Trump praised both Kelly and Milley. In fact, he said Kelly was, quote, one of the best people I've ever worked with. In addition to those two, Trump's national security advisors, two defense secretaries, even his vice president all say he's unfit to be president. Why should the American people hire Donald Trump when the people who worked most closely with him say that he's unfit to serve?
The people who worked most closely with him, most of them are supporting this ticket. You mentioned one person, two people, a disgruntled ex-employee, Kristen, who Donald Trump fired. He said something nice about him, and then he fired him, and now that person's attacking Donald Trump. But I think this is important because I think the American media has to be honest. Why is it, Kristen, that John Kelly doesn't like Donald Trump? It's not about personality, it's about policy. And I think the American people have the right to know that Donald Trump rejected the John Kelly, the Mark Milley consensus that America should be the policeman of the world. And because that, these folks hate him. If Donald Trump wanted to start a nuclear war with Russia, I guarantee you that John Kelly and Liz Cheney would be at the front of the line endorsing him. But I think the media misses something really important. This disagreement is not about personalities. This disagreement is because John Kelly didn't like the peace through strength policy of Donald Trump. I do, and I think the American people do.
Serving chief of staff, and Donald Trump says he only hires the best people. I got to keep moving, though, because our time is very limited. Former Vice President Mike Pence said, quote, President Trump asked me to put him over my oath to the Constitution. Anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States. Will your loyalty, Senator, be to the Constitution or to Donald Trump?
Well, of course, my loyalty is to the American people and to the United States Constitution. But I think the best way to accomplish that loyalty, Kristen, is to get back to a president who delivered the fastest rising take-home pay in a generation, 1.5% inflation, and a secure southern border. I don't think there's inconsistency between loyalty to the Constitution and support for Donald Trump. That's why I'm out there trying to persuade my fellow Americans that Donald Trump's presidency worked for them, and I'd like us to get back to those smart policies.
Just to put a very fine point on this, Mike Pence says Trump asked him to put Trump over the Constitution. If you find yourself in a similar position one day, will your loyalty be to the Constitution or to Donald J. Trump?
I just said my loyalty, Kristen, is to the Constitution of the United States.
Trump?
But have we talked at all about the unaffordable costs of groceries? Have we talked about the fact that because I brought it up, but young Americans can't afford a home? You didn't bring that up. I brought that up. It's so interesting, Kristen, because I think that Kamala Harris's campaign, and unfortunately, too many of her media allies are more interested in what Donald Trump has said than what Donald Trump did in office. You're more interested in what Kamala Harris is accusing Donald Trump of than what Donald Trump actually did during his 4 years in office, which is deliver peace and prosperity.
We're getting a hard wrap. So on the economy, quickly before I let you go, Donald Trump on Friday again floated the idea of getting rid of the federal income tax. Just to be clear, are you proposing eliminating all federal income taxes in a Trump-Vance administration?
Well, Donald Trump didn't propose that. He set that as an aspirational goal.
Is that something you would back, getting rid of all federal income taxes?
Well, I'm backing Donald Trump for president, and he set an aspirational goal and said, look, in this country for a long time, we funded the federal government primarily through tariffs. In other words, primarily through penalizing foreign corporations and foreign countries from taking advantage of our domestic markets. That's an aspirational goal. What is very real about what Donald Trump has actually proposed to specific policy proposals is that we want to eliminate taxes on tips. We want to eliminate taxes on overtime pay. That's the Donald Trump policy proposal. He's talking aspirationally about something that he himself thinks is less of a focus than cutting taxes on tips.
Getting a hard wrap, so just yes or no. Is getting rid of all federal income taxes on the table? It's a possibility under a Trump-Vance administration.
Is it on the table with the Democratic Congress that we have? I don't think that's realistic, Kristen. But I do think it's good to set an aspiration of what you want the country to look like.
So you don't rule it out.
Right now, we're working on cutting taxes on tips, cutting taxes on overtime.
Okay, so you're not ruling it out. Senator JD Vance.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Likewise.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.